experience
Oh,
as
for
well.
sure. Yeah, and I think part of our, at least initial motivation for talking about this subject is the question increasingly becomes what happens when the state becomes, to some extent, principally destructive. What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Deacon Max.
This is Deacon Joseph.
I was so excited for you to say that. So what's up with that introduction? It's a little different.
It's different. Okay. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but basically I've made the decision that when I get ordained a priest, I'm probably going to start going by Father Joseph, which is my baptismal name. And I made that decision a few months ago, but now I've just been getting tired of waiting, so I'm just going to start going by Deacon Joseph.
Oh boy.
So that's how I'm going to introduce myself. That's going to take all the listeners a while to get used to. That's going to take Deacon Max even longer to get used to. So you're probably still going to refer to me as Joey from time to time.
On accident. I will try to be respectful of your desires to transition, and I am here to support you in that new identity.
I am a transitional deacon.
We do transition pretty hard, you know.
We cannot make a clip of
we're
that.
We're all over the transitioning. Yep. We've been transitioning since me since June, you since some other times. It's just so this is double transition really for you. Anyways, okay. What's up, guys? Welcome to this episode of Logos Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about somebody who we're also familiar with. I mean, we read him. I mean, he's coffee table talk.
Yeah, we usually talk about him.
I mean, for breakfast, this guy comes up
days.
time and time again. Right?
I'm sure the listeners do too.
Oh, no, 100%. We're going to be talking about John Dewey and his philosophy of education, particularly. You know, John Dewey, as we'll get into who he is, what he's about. But that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Maybe you've heard of the Dewey Decimal System.
Dewey Decimal System.
That guy.
Same guy.
But we're not going to be talking about the Dewey Decimal System.
Whether you like it or not, whatever emotional ties you may have to the Dewey Decimal System, that's what we're going to be talking about.
You know who probably does love the Dewey Decimal System?
Who?
Our librarian here at the seminary.
If I had to guess, most librarians are big fans of the Dewey Decimal System.
Did he invent it, or is it just named after him?
That's a good question. If I had to guess, he probably invented it.
I would guess that too. We'll look that up at some point.
Yeah.
Welcome to Logos Podcast. As Deacon Max said, we are a podcast.
I did say that, and that is true.
It is.
It's in our name, actually.
We are a podcast.
That's true. Yeah.
And this podcast is about philosophy, theology, culture. It's about truth and leading you, our listeners, to a encounter with the Logos, who has changed our lives and whom we hope changes your life as well. So we're glad you're here. This is, well, first of all, what's up, Deacon Max? What's new in your life before brief overview. We got to get to the stuff, but first, our listeners want to know, how are you?
I'm really glad, listener, that you want to know.
They asked me.
They asked you?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm well. Thanks be to God. I have a big trip coming up in a few days.
Where are you going?
Tomorrow. So by the time this releases, it'll have been a few weeks at least. But I will be going to La Ciudad de Mexico.
Gosh.
I'm so excited. Go to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Go to the cathedral, hopefully, for some time. I'll be going with some Focus missionary alumni. And I'll be leading, me and another priest will be leading this pilgrimage there. And I'm super excited. And
I'm super jealous.
Yeah, you should be. You should be very jealous.
No,
listen, it's going to be great food, great people, great community, time of prayer. I'll be eye to eye with our Blessed Mother, Natilma. Although, for those of you who have never been to the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, it's a funny system they got there. It's very Mexican. It's really funny. You get there, right? And this huge basilica. I mean, you're talking about, I think they said something like 15 million pilgrims a year or something crazy, right? Come in a year. All right. But the way they have it is in order for people to move along this beautiful image quickly, they have kind of a what'd you call that?
Conveyor belt.
A conveyor belt. So you get on this conveyor belt, right? And all of a sudden you're like looking and you're like, and then you gotta walk back around and you're like, it's really a funny reality. And then there's little nuns, they're so happy to be there. Like the Sisters of Charity were there, for example, right? And they were so happy, and they were they're just looking at this thing as it's just a funny thing. But
that's so cool.
Efficient like Mexicans, but they never stop you from seeing it and having a good time like Mexicans.
One day I'll get there. Hopefully after our ordination.
That's right. We hope to go. But anyways, so that's what's going on right now. We have tests, papers, all this stuff coming up, but that's beside the point. I'm more excited about this currently, and I'm chilling. So how about you, bro? What's up?
I am great. As you know, because you were there, my younger sister got married this past weekend, which was, I've been telling people I think it was the happiest weekend of my life.
I think it's fair to say you looked very happy.
Yeah, over even more than my ordination. Now I think my priestly ordination will probably surpass it, but I was just overjoyed. I love my sister Patty and CJ. I love you guys so much. They're on their honeymoon right now out in California, but they're just wonderful. I love her husband and my whole family. All my friends were there. You got to be there, which was super special.
Yeah, that was great. I have to say, it was very moving to see you receive the vows, preach a homily, and just to witness the dynamic of your family. Seriously, it was really beautiful. When I was up there altar serving, so I felt like a little kid, just like,
but I was so thankful that you were there.
Yeah,
we needed you.
It worked out really well, and yeah, it was a really beautiful moment. I got to sit at the table with your grandparents and some of your other family, and who are listeners. In fact, they were making it very clear, and but it was fun. It was fun. It was a good time.
Yeah. So life is good. God is good, but we got to talk about John Dewey now.
Yeah. Even if your life isn't good, God is still good.
Yeah, that's true. So trust that, because it actually is true.
That's right.
All jokes aside. Why, Deacon Max, do we think it's worth people's time to listen to an episode about John Dewey? Why do we want to do this episode?
Because, believe it or not, whether you know it or not, whether you're intentionally doing it or not, a lot of our public school systems in America are deeply infused with the philosophy of John Dewey, specifically related to his philosophy of education, who man is, how man learns, and what the purpose of learning is. And so we figured, as we do from time to time, to talk about kind of the philosophical underpinnings of our contemporary societies. Right. And one of the major pillars of American society and Western civilization in general is the education system.
Yep.
And as a place that many, in fact, most people have the opportunity to go to in America, it necessarily informs the way that we see the world and the way that we live our lives. And so John Dewey here, we're arguing, is a major influence in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, if you graduated or attended public schools like Deacon Max and I both did growing up, then you've been impacted by this guy, even if you don't know it. And I bet even if you didn't go to public schools, his thought has probably seeped into a lot of our private school education systems, even Catholic schools, I would bet. And what we're going to see is that it's a bit troubling, because John Dewey was a Marxist, and he was an atheist, and he was a materialist. And it is his thought that is undergirding a lot of the way that we do public education in the United States. So it's going to be good to look at his ideas. It's helpful to me to kind of read about these thinkers that have these ideologies that underpin the current structures that we have, because it helps me to recognize the way that my worldview has been shaped, that it's been, this world that's been given to me that is not necessarily true, right? And to help me kind of step outside of the worldview that was presented to me just implicitly through this, the school system.
Plato's cave, right?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. It's the process of, stepping up higher and higher into closer to the truth, and trying to understand what was good about, my experience growing up, and then what was flawed, and how my habits of thinking and acting now should change based on, what I understand went wrong in the past. So
and part of that assessment requires that, as we do time and time again on this podcast, that we present to you a more Christocentric, more Catholic view of the world,
yes.
as opposed to what we would say a more liberal maybe view of the world.
Right.
And so John Dewey, as you'll find out, we'll be a little critical of, but we'll also try to bring out the strengths, as we like to do on this podcast. What are some points that maybe he's that are, we would say, even dangerous, maybe? And other points that maybe can be redeemed.
Yeah. But just to that point before we start, because that's you're right about the Christocentrism. You think about the saints, and the saints lived in this.
Wait, give me a second. Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking about the saints now. Yeah. Thank you.
I was just so confused. I was like, are we stopping the podcast? The saints lived in this space where their entire world, their worldview was the biblical worldview. They saw reality at, through the eyes of faith, kind of as it is, and they understood spiritual realities in a way that oftentimes is foreign to me, right? And why is that? Well, because I don't have as much faith as they do yet. I'm not as close to God as they are, but also because I've been taught to see the world in a way other than what is actually true, right? So again, coming to understand that worldview that we've been given is helpful. So to start this, discussion, maybe we should talk about who John Dewey was.
Yeah.
Some just basic biographical info. Who was this guy?
So he was born mid-19th century, 1859.
Yeah.
And lived to mid-20th century, 1952. So almost 100 years old. Not quite, just by a few years, right? Almost 100 years old. He was born on October 20th in Burlington, Vermont, attended the University of Vermont, where he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy in 1879, continued his studies at Johns Hopkins University, which is a prominent college in the United States, focusing on psychology and philosophy. From what I understand, he wrote his doctoral thesis on what's his name? It's not coming to me now. David Hume's Idealism.
Oh, really?
That's right. That's what I understand. I've heard that the thesis can't be found, but somehow there's historical records that track this. Nevertheless, I hear there's some influence there from David Hume's Idealism. He was raised a Christian.
I think a Protestant Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Protestant denomination exactly, but raised a Christian.
Yeah.
But became a materialist, a naturalist,
as he called it. Yeah. And he did have a pretty impressive career. So he's one of the most, famous. One of the famous American philosophers that we have kind of like to boast of as Americans. So he taught philosophy at several universities, including the University of Michigan, which is not surprising. I say because I'm an Ohio State fan. Okay, and Columbia University, where he became a leading voice in educational theory. So, and then he was eventually deeply involved in the University of Chicago, right? I think that's where he spent the latter part of his career and did a lot of thinking there.
A lot of models of education. Yeah. Try to kind of experiment with what would be good, what would not be.
Yeah, and in fact, we'll talk about this later in the episode, but he and a group of colleagues, I think they even founded like an experimental school for kids so that they could try to basically implement their kind of educational philosophy in a real life setting.
And keep this in mind too, psychology wasn't as prominent as it is today. Right. So for somebody like Dewey and others to have applied psychology to things, and especially in education, was kind of a new thing. It was really, really revolutionary in some sense. And so that's why
cutting edge stuff. Yeah.
Cutting edge stuff for sure. And, funny, I wanted to bring this point up, is that throughout the history of John Dewey, if you read up on him, is you learn that he actually wasn't a good teacher, or at least he didn't consider himself a good teacher. So after just a few years of actually teaching, he was like, all right, I can't do this. So he left and studied philosophy and became a philosopher, which of education, which, can happen. You don't have to be at, there's a lot of coaches you see out there that probably can't run a mile to save their lives, but they're making their football players run every single bit of that mile and then teaching them how to play the game. So you could kind of, in some sense, have principled mastery over a thing and not yourself maybe embody it. And so maybe that's what you see here. I don't know, but I think he considered himself not a very good teacher.
That's right, which I think is important,
Yeah.
It's always, this is kind of the stereotype of philosophers, like, oh, they're just like these abstract kind of like unintelligible thinkers, but then once you get into the real world, they're not helpful at all.
Yeah.
Dewey kind of
fill that category.
Fits that model.
And he had international.
He ended up being very famous during his lifetime.
So like China and Japan specifically.
Yeah, he traveled there. That's right. They even called him like a new Confucius and like Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, which we'll talk about. Those are two.
They call me Mr. Worldwide. That's right. Mr. Globe Wide.
I feel like I've heard some of your songs then, if that's the case.
Mr. Milky Way Wide. That's right. That's right, baby. Take that, Pitbull.
We were at this wedding, and my sister had a great playlist of music, and Deacon Mass comes up to me. He's like, these people, they want Pitbull. They know it. They know they want Pitbull.
And then he came on, and what happened?
Did he come on?
He came on, dude.
What song was that?
He came on. I think it's Hotel.
Yeah,
and I was like, as soon as everybody came out, dude, even the old ladies, the middle-aged ladies who didn't know what Dale was saying, they were dropping it like it's hot. And I told you, bro.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, I should.
All right, cool.
But it's worth saying that when John Dewey came back from his international travels, he was actually so inspired by the way that they did education in some of these communist countries that he wanted to implement those systems in America. And so again, a lot of his ideologies ended up being very dangerous and coming from some very evil motives. Okay, and then just philosophically, so now we're going to get into some of his philosophy. He became
such a smooth transition, Deacon Joey. I got to say,
it's my forte, bro.
Thanks, man.
Smooth criminal.
Well done,
Deacon Joseph.
See, there he goes. We're trying.
See, I'm not even going to recognize it at first.
Right.
Okay, Dewey became one of the most influential American philosophers and educators of the 20th century, and importantly, he was one of the founders of the philosophy called Pragmatism. So if we're going to understand Dewey, we need to understand pragmatism.
Yeah, we do.
So let's step back for a second and talk broader view. What is pragmatism? What's this kind of philosophical movement that he was a part of?
So first of all, pragmatism is actually one of the only philosophies that America can truly claim for itself.
That's right.
Right. It has some influence from Austria, but it's mostly American. And some of the lead thinkers of that movement were like William James, I think Rogers, Charles Peirce, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who's very popular in educational circles and theory, and John Dewey.
And they may have all been like friends too.
They definitely had correspondences,
Okay.
But I don't know how closely linked they were.
Okay.
I think John Dewey and William James specifically were close friends.
Maybe even colleagues.
Yeah, and the pragmatism, right? So what is it? What is this philosophy? The heart of pragmatism, which I think we've talked about to some extent in our podcast, or at least alluded to, is this idea that truth is a process discovered in the interplay between ideas and their practical outcomes.
Yeah.
Right? So something is true to the idea that it practically benefits man. Right?
It's true if it works.
Exactly. So it's true if it works. Exactly. So truth has a functionary essence to it.
Right.
And so something like metaphysics, right? Theology,
Yeah.
philosophy, and the liberal arts in general would be undermined,
Right.
Because they would be useless.
Yep.
Right? They're not effective. They're not productive. They don't produce profit. And so pragmatism would see those fields of study as again, useless because truth is not embodied, let's say, in those things.
Right.
And at least in the mind of the pragmatist.
Yeah, and this is, kind of makes sense that this is the one American philosophy because we're so good at like producing, getting stuff done,
And the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution.
Right, in England and in America, there's a major part of how we built our society in a lot of ways. And so this is a philosophy that takes up that kind of torch.
But it is important to, I think, contextualize it in terms of the history of philosophy because Dewey and these pragmatists, they're responding to kind of the strands of philosophy that have been going on since the beginning of modernity with Descartes, right? So,
That's right.
So Descartes tries to achieve a certain amount of certainty through just kind of going into his own head, right? And then the problem with philosophy for the next couple hundred years, really after that, was that philosophers seem to be stuck inside of their own heads.
Right.
And they're like, is there any correspondence between what's in our mind and what's in reality? And they got up, I think for erroneous reasons, they got caught in this dilemma because they didn't know the tradition and they didn't know St. Thomas Aquinas and they didn't, and ultimately they were grasping at certainty, like trying to become like gods. But that's a whole nother discussion. But
one of the things that I wanted to mention that it adopted was a Marxist view, right? That the aim of philosophy is actually not to understand the world, or the aim, we could say, of education in general is not to understand the world, but actually to change
the world,
to revolutionize it.
Yeah. So this is what I mean. Dewey, he's reading this philosophical tradition about all these, abstract philosophers arguing about what's going on inside of our heads, and he's like, look, none of this matters. All that matters is like whether or not your ideas lead to productivity.
And this is partly influenced too, what you had mentioned before we cut the cameras on, Hegel. You want to talk about that just briefly?
Well, yeah, we'll see that, Hegel had this idea of the dialectic of history, that history is kind of progressing and ideas are kind of unfolding throughout history in such a way that as we move through history, truth is changing and we're coming into a greater and greater understanding and grasp of like the truth.
And so objective truths are difficult.
There is really no objective
Exactly.
truth. Like it can all change. And so Dewey thinks that this moment in history in which he lives is the most recent expression of kind of like the absolute truth, which is like, democracy and free society and the Industrial Revolution.
Religious freedom.
Like these things are of supreme value because this is what history has brought us to. And history is kind of like a god itself.
And
right?
as such, schools become an instrument
right.
for addressing these concrete historical situations.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So truth is about productivity. It's not about understanding reality. It's not about contemplating the truth. It's about doing things.
Yeah.
It's about getting stuff done.
And this is where you might sometimes have heard this concept, the pragmatic maxim. That's where that is. The maxim is that truth is true to the extent that it has a productive credibility. So
Right.
just to reiterate the point here and use actual kind of Deweyan lingo, there it is.
But so now that we've kind of understood pragmatism, this broader philosophical movement that Dewey was a founder of, we can start to get into what he taught about education, about human knowledge, and then ultimately the function that he thought that schools, like specifically public schools, should play in society. So I guess his biggest work on education was called Democracy and Education. This is his famous kind of work. It was written in 1916.
It's a difficult read, by the way. When I first got to seminary, it's one of the books that, for some reason, was very attractive to me at the time. Democracy, something in my mind that I loved. Education, something in my mind that I loved. And I was like, here it is.
Boom.
And but it's very complex.
He's not a very clear writer.
He's not.
And
he's a prolific writer, but he's not very clear.
Which,
I suppose, if you're a prolific writer, not all of your ideas are going to be very clear.
Well, but
right?
I don't know. I think the more intelligent you are, the simpler and clearer your communication of those ideas can become.
That's true.
Like you look at someone like Ratzinger, or like, although John Paul II, sometimes he's hard to understand.
He can be pretty complex.
Anyways, Dewey wrote a lot, and he's hard to read. But this book, Democracy and Education, argued that education, which had been in the time frame that he was living in, it had become this place. The way that he saw it was a problem that it was just a bunch of students in rows in a classroom, and a teacher just kind of lecturing, like pouring information into like the empty heads of the students.
Questions were not really allowed.
Yeah, no questions, which is all rote memorization. And Dewey saw this as very mechanical and very inadequate, and it didn't actually engage the students in any real way. And so what he wanted in a more like democratic kind of mode was that he wanted education to be more child-driven and child-centered.
Subject-centered.
Right. The child is kind of the initiator. Mm-hmm. And he wanted it to be interactive and experiential, which there's definitely some merit to, and we'll talk about that as we go. But and again, he thought that this democracy, this forum for the free exchange of ideas that he saw as like this beautiful product of the movement of history existing here in America, should be the model for school as well, not just for society but for school, and that through being brought up in like a democratic school, students would become democratic citizens. They'd start to think with the mindset of the state, ultimately.
Yeah, and so schools become the instrument of the state.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's kind of the idea here.
Now, it's probably helpful to think about the way that Dewey understood human learning in general, for us to really appreciate what he wanted school to look like. And again, not all of his views about education have been perfectly adopted in our modern system.
No, yes.
But his philosophy is very influential. And a lot of educators, I think, today probably read his stuff.
They do, at the very least. Yeah, I mean, he's a major figure within education, philosophy of education specifically. But also, these philosophies like pragmatism is not his own philosophy, right? Or as we're about to mention, he's influenced by we've mentioned Hegel, Marxism, but also Darwinism and naturalism. But these are not all his philosophies, but these are philosophies that he embodied. And then he wrote according to in his own idea of pedagogy, learning, school systems, democracy, etc. So,
and many of these philosophies, like the biggest problem with Dewey is that he's a materialist, and that he's kind of an atheistic materialist. Ultimately,
we'll talk a little bit more about here.
Right. So this kind of because he's a materialist and because he's influenced by Charles Darwin, he thinks that that the human being is just a material organism, right? There's no like spiritual soul. There's no immateriality of the human being. There's no transcendence. And so he thinks that the process of learning is kind of like this pure evolutionary materialistic thing that takes place, right? So he says that the organism interacts with the world through self-guided activity that coordinates and integrates sensory and motor responses. Like that's how he described learning.
Right.
And he said that this process has 3 basic steps that teachers in schools should be able to keep in mind as they're trying to manage their classrooms and stuff. So he says the first thing that happens in the process...
For those listening, this is what's famously known as a theory of inquiry.
Yeah, thank you for stopping.
Right, this is a theory of inquiry. It's kind of a 3-step, sometimes 4-step process. But
right, and he used that phrase, the theory of inquiry, instead of the term logic, right?
That's right.
Because he's trying to break away from these traditional like Aristotelian categories of like logic and metaphysics. He's using new terminology. Yeah. So he calls this process by which human beings come to know things his theory of inquiry, and he says that it's 3 basic steps. The first step is that a problematic situation arises, right? So a student encounters a problem. And in this problem, like the instinctive or habitual responses of the human organism are inadequate for what they're being presented with.
Yeah.
And so they can't actually fulfill the desires that they're trying to fulfill. So that's step one. Just a problematic situation arises. Step two is this: the human brain in some like naturalistic, materialistic way, almost like a natural selective kind of way, like distills the relevant data in the situation that's being encountered. And then step three is this reflective phase, which I don't know how Dewey would explain this happening without some sort of immaterial soul, like faculty of the intellect that can actually think in terms of universals.
Memory or imagination,
right?
These kinds of things, yeah.
Right. So I don't know how he would explain this, but he says the third phase, this reflective phase, is that the organism, the human, forms, encountering this problem, forms hypothetical solutions, and then kind of walks through each of them in his mind or in his brain, and then decides to act upon one of them. And then it becomes like a process of trial and error. Like if this hypothetical solution to this problem that I'm facing works, then it becomes like a working theory for the way that the world is, right? Not like a universal truth that I assent to or that I know, because again, it could always change in future experiences. But it becomes, this kind of working theory. And if one hypothesis doesn't work through my concrete action, then I'll kind of like recalculate and try something else, and then eventually discover like kind of theories or ideas that I can use in further practical activity.
Yeah, and that's a major point, right? So it's like we encounter a problematic situation, we distill the data in order to figure out what the situation is, and then we have this reflective phase that then moves us to action. And to the extent that those ideas can actually be lived out in this practical situation is the extent to which those ideas are actually true. And
right.
To the idea that they are not actually true because they're not productive.
Yeah, and true, of course, taken in a relative sense, right? Because even if it's productive now, and I say, okay, this idea is true, it could maybe not be productive later, and so it could change, right? So there is no like universal objective truth that my mind discovers. It's just what works. So, and again, this is the philosophy of the guy who's at the, it's materialistic. There's no God, there's no understanding, there's no like search for wisdom. It's all just like what works and what and all material processes, right?
Yeah, it's like it's in a sort of ways to kind of the scientific hypothesis. Right? Or the idea of like critical thinking,
yep.
we could use in more kind of contemporary terms, or a lot of like the STEM school programs would maybe emphasize this idea of you've confronted a problem, distill data, and then reflect so as to be able to live out a practical hypothesis that you're now concluded to. Here's a quote that I actually want to read you.
Yeah, please, I was going to ask you to read this quote.
Cool. So here's a quote from Dewey on inquiry, actually. He writes, inquiry is a controlled or directed transformation of an indeterminate situation into one that is so determinate in its constituent distinctions and relations as to convert the elements of the original situation into a unified whole. Easy.
Super clear.
Done. Y'all should be able to get that no problem.
Never read anything clearer than that.
Talking about the theory of inquiry here. What information are you distilling right now?
Yeah, this is a problematic situation.
This is a problematic situation
that I need to try to confront. No, I mean, I kind of get what he's saying. I think it's basically a summary of that 3-step process that I just kind of explained. But again, he writes very abstractly and obtusely, so it's kind of hard to read. But
the point here is just not like when we're confronted with difficult situations, our idea of processing them helps us navigate, understand them, and then live out concretely.
Right. So for this reason, Dewey did not want education to be a teacher in a classroom lecturing and like disciplining the students, right? He wanted it to be student driven. He wanted it to be very hands-on. He wanted it to be a collaborative enterprise where like students are talking to each other and exchanging ideas.
And the teacher is just really a proxy. The parents are also kind of proxies in this determining kind of determinate school system.
Yeah. The teacher is not imparting truth so much as guiding and kind of facilitating this organic, biological, Darwinistic process by which the students practically make their way through the world.
And it's not to say that in Dewey's thought, teachers didn't know anything. In fact, teachers by necessity knew more than the students. But the teachers would not necessarily say, here's the answer, memorize this, come back to me with this, and then you will have excelled at this particular subject matter. It's more so like the teacher would be kind of a referee in the room and be like, ooh, well, you're going to kill yourself, come back. But she wouldn't be, or he wouldn't be as interactive.
Yeah, and there's a reason that Dewey didn't want the teachers feeding knowledge to the students. It's because he was influenced by Marx. And so he viewed everything through these power dynamics. And he thought that if students are just imbibing knowledge that teachers give to them, that's naturally what it's going to do is perpetuate the status quo, which is ultimately a system in which the oppressors are keeping the oppressed down. And so teachers, if you just have a society in which students are kind of blindly imbibing knowledge that teachers are just pouring into their heads, then an oppressive class can just continue to indoctrinate students into the system of thinking that is leading to their own oppression. So he's viewing this through very like Marxist terms, which is why, again, he wants the students to be the active initiators. Now, it's funny, though, in this experimental school that he set up in Chicago with some of his colleagues when he started kind of trying to like implement some of these ideas, I think they had some success because, again, there are some merits to this model. But I read in one article that not everyone was applauding it, even though it was this new like cutting edge thing, because these kids would come home from school and the parents realized that they had just been like running around like doing nothing all day. And then the parents had to actually be the ones to teach them how to read and write. Like they weren't learning at school. And so it leads to, I think chaos
in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
When you put too much onus. And it's not to denigrate kids. It's not to think any less of kids. It's just the reality of the matter. To live in reality is to, in fact, live in truth and to live in love for kids to recognize, hey, they're limited beings, and that's all right.
Yeah.
That's okay. But I wanted to talk about kind of, which I think is very important, kind of transition into the second half of the conversation, namely the actual social function of schools.
Right.
And Dewey's thought, as we mentioned earlier, that book, Democracy and Education.
Yeah.
Right. It has, it turns out, education, a social function. It's oriented towards something else. And we've alluded to it already, right? And I think we should talk about that a little more because it helps us understand even more so how we continue to see the social effects of Dewey's thought still today.
Yeah, I mean, basically, he wanted school to become this democratic and scientific environment so that students could become democratic and scientific American citizens, right? Which is, in one sense, a very reasonable intuition that, the way that we form our students is going to impact our society at large.
Like we should have the Pledge of Allegiance, in my argument, back in the classrooms.
Yeah.
For this reason, just to install something like authentic patriotism in our students.
Right. But in Dewey's view, the school is really the instrument and in many ways the most important instrument of the state. Right. And it's forming students who, again, are just material organisms in his mind in these habits of thinking and acting that are particularly American and that are consistent with like democratic American ideals, which in his mind are necessarily divorced from like God, faith, religion, like these things. I think he admitted of like the necessity of religion, but just as like a social function.
Sure. And
the God he argued for is just like almost like the social God of like democracy or good citizenship or something like that. Don't quote me on that because I didn't read up on that too much, but for him, that's what the essence of the school is, right? It's forming citizens who think the way the state wants them to think.
There's this idea of in Dewey that education is a social process. Again, it's the unfolding of reality according to what times allow. To take that kind of motif of Hegel back up again. It's this idea that the classroom is kind of the instantiation of what democracy looks like.
Right.
And democracy looks like what? Well, for one, it's a process of inquiry, theory of inquiry, right? That we live out in this classroom and that we then begin to embody at the larger level. So the school becomes a place that influences the students themselves, the family structure, the larger community. So like city councils, I would imagine, or theater, arts, whatever, all the way to the federal level. And this whole idea of truth is not some abstract thing. in Dewey's mind. It's not for its own sake. In
Right.
fact, it's for something else.
Yeah.
Right, for something else. So as you pointed out rightly, the school then becomes the instrument of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, anyways, yeah, just to hammer that point back home.
Which I went to public school. You went to public school.
Yep.
That was like, the more I reflect on it, that was definitely my experience. Like, I think that the prerogatives of the state were imbued all throughout my experience in public school. Was that your experience?
Oh,
as
for
well?
sure, for sure. Yeah, and I think part of our, at least initial motivation for talking about this subject is the question increasingly becomes, what happens when the state becomes, to some extent, principally destructive, like partaking in certain ideologies
Right.
that are harmful to kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not just like a little negligent, but I mean like intentionally malpractice and erroneous in anthropological assumptions and epistemological practice.
Yep.
Like what, and that's what I think what we're getting into now. It's
Yeah.
part of the difficulty now is that as parents that are listening to us, as young adults who are listening to us that may have siblings or maybe teachers yourselves, that are listening to this podcast, it's very hard to teach kids nowadays. We don't teach kids in, at least I don't, I should say, teach kids at a school, as I'm sure maybe some of you do. Do you teach at a school?
I'm not currently. No.
Okay, but I do have a significant amount of run-ins by teaching catechesis class, kids and adults alike.
Right. Yep.
Right. And kids today are great. They're a blessing from God.
Mm-hmm.
God loves kids. He welcomed them. He embraces them. In fact, you have to be like a child to get to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Not literally. You don't have to be 6 years old. If you're over 6 years old, you're still big enough for the ride.
Shot.
But the point being here is that these kids are taking in a lot of information through social media.
Mm-hmm.
They're also, it seems to me, in a lot of ways, not learning how to be good citizens. Right? So they're going to school and they may be learning how to work a computer. They may be learning how to do math through whatever methods, whatever the hippest method of education is. But the schools aren't serving to actually immerse these kids in a fuller life, it would seem to me. And in fact, sometimes even immersed in erroneous ideas, something popular like transgenderism, right? That's kind of running rampant, or a bunch of inclusive and equality movements that are forcing these kids to, rather than learning how to be a holistic person, become more confused on top of the confusion they already incur as being young kids.
Yeah, and I think so. Now I guess we can move into this kind of our assessment of Dewey's thought.
Sure.
If you're ready for that, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say.
Yeah, I already kind of alluded to it. But
yeah, but I think this is a good transition into that, because I'm thinking of my own life. Like, there's so much stuff that I don't know that I would have known if my teacher actually sat me down and forced me to memorize it. Like my geography, my world geography, my American geography, terrible.
My grammar, terrible.
Just because, and so, Dewey, I think he was right in saying that education should involve like the engagement of the child more. It should involve the subject.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And maybe I should have said that too. I don't want to demean that. I think he has some, and in fact, I think that emphasis of the subject, the church acknowledged in things like personalism within her own philosophy that was adopted by Pope St. John Paul II. Right. Phenomenology, which takes the conscious subjectivity, also very important. We recognize that the subject's experience also can speak objectively about reality. So we don't want to just undermine Dewey's idea of, well, let's talk about what the child has to say. No, the child is an important agent in this aspect too. But the point being is that the child is not the only agent.
And the child is a child. Like this is the thing for me. Like, Dewey is so suspicious of authority because he's a Marxist, right? Like he's suspicious of authority because he thinks that anytime someone is using power over another, it is necessarily to promote their own self-interest. It's necessarily tyranny or oppression of some kind. But that's not true. Like, the Marxist understanding of reality is false. And so a teacher is supposed to have real power and authority over the students, and has a responsibility to exercise that power and authority for the sake of the students, to lead the students from imperfection to perfection, right? And it's not that when I say imperfection to perfection, I don't mean like that a student is imperfect, like morally bad. I mean that like a child is a perfect child, but an imperfect adult, right? Like a child is has a nature that has potentiality that needs to be activated by someone who's already in actuality at a higher level. Like they need to they need to come down. Like this is the gracious act of God that's modeled to us, and it's what teachers are called to do with their vocation, to come down and raise up the students who are entrusted to them. And yes, that involves respecting the individuality and the subjectivity of the student, but it also involves like, I'm going to sit you down and I'm going to make you memorize this right now. Because if you don't, and I just let you be this driver of your own education, you're never going to know what the state capitals are, which I don't. Full disclosure. I know some of them.
And there it is.
But like nobody ever made me know them. Nobody ever made me learn them.
True. Yeah.
And I think it's partly because these ideas was like, oh, we're going to let the children kind of like be the drivers of the process. Like, no, I'm a child, and unless the love and law of an adult is given to me, I'm never going to learn what I need to learn.
Yeah, I would argue that if you overemphasize the subjectivity of a child, it's not an act of love either.
Right.
Right. Because love has to be responsibly given.
Yeah.
Responsibly guided. And to this end, I think it's important that we move into and talk about if this is some of our criticism and maybe even some of our acknowledgments of the strengths of the likes of John Dewey and those who've adopted his philosophy. And again, I kind of want to make this caveat before we move into this last point. The schools of today are not exactly what John Dewey envisioned.
Yeah, totally.
In fact, he would envision something more like what we consider more of a traditional education in some senses. I think he's been misappropriated to some extent, but I also think, again, we've been a little critical of his philosophy because it is true. We've adopted a philosophy that is in large part American in birth and then lived out by very important historical thinkers like John Dewey. But I think we want to propose a solution, maybe
an alternative
vision of maybe just some principles of what an education could look like in the Christian worldview, in the Catholic worldview specifically.
Yeah. I know you're very passionate about this topic.
I am, and I have to admit to you all, I haven't had a lot of ability to put this into practice yet, like John Dewey. So, no, but I am passionate about this in part because I feel like I didn't receive the tradition of my faith well. Not just education in general, but the tradition of my faith well.
Right.
And it's not to dig at my parents. They really tried. They tried as best as they could. My grandparents, they tried as best as they could. But they're limited human beings.
Right.
And I guess more so as a frustration, maybe I should say it's I've learned to appreciate the gift that I have been given while being in seminary, for example. Right. And the first thing that I maybe want to point out is like what is generally speaking the point of education, and to prove this, or to talk about this, I actually want to point to the etymology of the word. Right? Education comes from the word educare, right? Which means to lead out.
Latin,
right? It means to lead out a person. We could say from their ego, from the darkness of their intellect, from the weakness of their will, from the disorder of their passions, towards something what St. Thomas Aquinas would say their ultimate end. Right? Again, you made that point earlier, from imperfection to perfection. The kid from kid to adult.
Think about the allegory of the cave, leading someone out of the shackles of ignorance into the truth of the light. Or
Dante's Divine Comedy. Right? It's the movement from hell, we could say, to heaven. Right? It's this idea that like education at its best actually leads the person out of their ego, not just egocentric, but other-centric. Right? And so in I guess what I'm kind of arguing is in John Dewey's view, because there's an overemphasis on history, nature, and pragmatism, or the productive capacity of reality, we begin to see this move of truth, not something that is an end of itself, but rather something that is for the sake of something else. Right? Rather than seeing virtue or something like goodness, truth, or beauty as things that we should always aspire to because that's what we're made for. In the end, they become instruments for something, for power. They become an instrument for productivity. And in fact, a lot of our university systems, one could easily critique by saying they actually put a premium on those students who are most productive at what they do. who do the best grades that they have. And that's not to say that's not a good thing. These are good measures of education to some extent.
Yeah.
But the person's worth is not in those things.
Right.
But we've built a culture, right, where leading the person out of themselves is not the primary thing.
Right.
Where actually empowering that same person to become kind of a tyrant is actually almost a standard of today's education. Rather than challenging the person to be selfless sacrifices of love, we've empowered them to become very, very selfish. And I see it in myself first. And I think a good education, a proper Christian education, views a cross as a sign of true freedom. The cross in which our Lord laid his life out, right? But didn't do it. I mean, did it in a certain way to save us, but did it because he loved above all, because he is the truth.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think any system of education, any philosophy of education that treats the human person as just a material thing that doesn't have any transcendence or relationship to the infinite is destined to be inadequate, just because the human person is open to transcendence. It has the capax Dei, the capacity for God. And we do have this capacity to, this is kind of how Aristotle would understand reason and rationality. It's this capacity to perceive the universals behind particulars, right? So like I see Deacon Max and I see another particular human being and I see what's common between them, and using my reason, I can grasp the universal, which is human nature, which is unchanging, which I can come to contemplate and then know, and then grow closer and closer into wisdom, right? And with John Dewey's understanding of what education is about, yes, he wants to make like responsible citizens, and he does even say he's not just trying to make school a thing that ends up allowing you to contribute to the economy. Like he does have a more sophisticated understanding than that. He wants like people who can like live in a democratic society and collaborate with each other, right? Like that's kind of his goal. But if that's it, if it's not like the acquisition of wisdom
and virtue,
then I think it's significantly missing the mark. I have a passage from Ratzinger that I think I'd like to read, if you're okay with it, about.
I don't know, listeners, you tell me, are you okay with it?
Relates to this thing.
I'm speaking for our listeners here, I think we're okay with it.
I just wanted to give you, if you had anything else to say before I read some Ratzinger.
Dude, I know you've been excited about this.
Okay.
Give us some, who doesn't like some?
So this is an Introduction to Christianity, which is a great book, which you should read if you haven't. And he's talking about.
Also, it's not much of an introduction, just an FYI.
Well, it's much less simple than you would think an introduction might be.
There we go.
But it is a good introduction. I want Jordan Peterson to read this book really bad.
Also, if you have any contacts with Jordan Peterson, let us know. We'll send him a book signed by Deacons Joseph and Deacon Max.
Dude, that would make his day.
Of course it would.
Can you do a Jordan Peterson impression? I can't.
No, I've tried. It's hard.
Yeah, someone asked me to do one the other day, and I started to, and it was just terrible.
That was terrible. It's not easy.
Anyways, this is what Ratzinger, he's actually describing this transition in the modern world towards a more pragmatic understanding of reality. Right?
Of course he does.
So he's not talking about John Dewey and pragmatists in the American context, but he is talking about the transition from thinking of truth as contemplating like being itself to truth as doing and making things. So Ratzinger says this. He says, for the ancient world and the Middle Ages, being itself is true. In other words, apprehensible, because God made it, and he made it by thinking it. To the creative original spirit, the creator spiritus, thinking and making are one and the same thing. His thinking is a creative process. Things are because they are thought. In the ancient and medieval view, all being is, therefore, what has been thought, the thought of the absolute spirit of God. Conversely, this means that since all being is thought, all being is meaningful. It's logos, it's truth. It follows from this traditional view that human thinking is the rethinking of being itself, rethinking of the thought that is being itself. Man can rethink the logos, the meaning of being, because his own logos, his own reason, is logos of the one true logos. It's the thought of the original thought, of the creative spirit that permeates and governs all being. So that's like the description of how things used, like the traditional worldview, right? Then Ratzinger starts to explain this transition into a more pragmatic worldview.
By the way, if you want a summary of my master's thesis, there it is.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Why didn't I just write your master's thesis by plagiarizing Ratzinger?
Well, that's exactly what I did. So we can't both plagiarize, bro.
Okay, so that's the ancient kind of understanding of truth and being and reality. And then he starts to talk about this shift into pragmatism and this pragmatic understanding of the world. So he actually talks about the first thinker to do this named Giambattista Vico, who lived in like the 18th century, so even before Dewey. But he says this. He says, following in this medieval thought process, following in formally in Aristotle's footsteps, this guy, Vico, asserts that real knowledge is the knowledge of causes. Okay, so Aristotle had said if we want to know something, we need to know the causes. And the highest form of knowledge is the knowledge of the highest cause, the first cause, which is the unmoved mover, which is God. But Vico says this. He says, if part of real knowledge is the knowledge of causes, then we can only truly know what we have made ourselves. For it is only ourselves that we are familiar with. This means that the old equation of truth and being is replaced by the new one of truth and factuality. All that can be known is that which we have made ourselves. It is not the task of the human mind, nor is it within its capacity to think about being. Rather, it is to think about the fact, to think about what has been made, man's own particular world, for this is all we can really understand. So because in the modern world we had reached this point where we thought that we could not understand God and that we could not like think about God anymore, we were in this kind of existential crisis, and we arrived at this place where we were like, okay, well, what we can understand is what we've made, what we do, like what we produce, right? Okay, let me keep reading.
And this is part going back to the Marxist view, right? The alienation from our work.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're doing all of these things in the Industrial Revolution, right? We have these radically rich capitalists, the bourgeois, and then we have the proletariat, the poor people. And the poor people are producing all the stuff for the rich people, but they're not. They're doing stuff, but their being is actually really detached from what they're doing.
Yeah. So Ratzinger says that this shift into thinking that we can only know that which we've made is then further supplanted by the Marxist doctrine, which is philosophy is not about understanding, but about changing the world. So it's not just that which we have made that we can understand. It's that which we can transform the world into becoming that we can understand. So this is important because basically what's happening here is that when we cut ourselves off from God and we began to think of ourselves as just material beings like Dewey did, then we had to find certainty. We had to like find something that seemed like the truth. And so what we did was we said, okay, well, we can understand what we make. So that is what's true. But then we realized, like, if there really is just like material stuff and that's all there is, then there's ultimately no meaning. Like, then we're in trouble. And so to remedy that existential anxiety within us, what we ended up doing was saying, okay, we just have to create the meaning, right? We have to, now meaning is what we are going to change the world into. And so now truth, Ratzinger says, is not just what we have made, but it's what we can repeat over and over again through scientific experimentation. As making, and then it's ultimately what we can transform the world into. That the process of coming to know the truth is one and the same thing with the process of manipulating the world as we want. And this is attractive.
Talking about the theory of inquiry. I mean, that's what that is.
Right. That's exactly what this is. So there's Ratzinger talking about this very thing. So he says the truth with which man is concerned is neither the truth of being, nor even in the last resort that of his accomplished deeds, but the truth of changing the world, of molding the world, a truth centered on a future and action. And this is like what we're living in right now, right?
And this is what has, in some parts, I think, made Jordan Peterson so popular.
Yes,
he makes this point time and time again, based on Carl Jung, that man is incapable of making meaning.
Yes,
and just Ratzinger talks about this time and time again,
yes.
Right? Which is why we use in our Christian tradition something like the creed.
Right. Right.
We can talk about in a little bit if
Yeah.
you want, but this idea of belief, right? In the Creed, in the Nicene Creed, we use this quote at the beginning of the Creed, in English at least, we say, I believe, right? In Latin, credo, right? This assent, this act is a personal act recognizing that I am incapable of completely understanding what life is. The act of belief is the act of recognizing that there is something beyond me.
Yeah, that I did not make.
I did not make that exactly, but that I enter into.
Yes.
As
yes.
given as something that gives me meaning.
Right. So the primacy is on the receptivity, not on the making, right? Because, and this is what Dewey actually said in some of his writing. He's like, the reason he wants a more democratic America, a more democratic school system, is because he knows that like we're somehow, he said that we're somehow like creating meaning by like transforming the world gradually, making it more democratic, more scientific. But the problem with that is that, again, self-made meaning is not meaning at all. Meaning has to come to us from above. It's not something that we can produce on our own. Which is why, so Ratzinger, he talks about, I'm going to read, this is the last passage I'm going to read, okay? So just bear with me. He's talking about this distinction between making and receiving, right? And he says, in this context, it is perhaps here necessary to draw attention to a distinction made by Martin Heidegger, who speaks of the duality of calculating and reflective thought. So there's these two different modes of thought that we can have as humans. Calculating, kind of like this making thought, this stuff by which we do things, or reflective thought, this thought that by which we receive meaning, right?
So maybe we should call Dewey's third step of theory of inquiry not reflective but calculative phase.
Yes, you're right.
Something like that.
Yeah. I think that's more accurate based on what he would understand.
Correct.
Whereas Heidegger and other people like Joseph Pieper would point to this other way of thinking, this reflective thought, this intellectus, which we've talked about on the podcast before. But okay, so calculating and reflective thought, Ratzinger says both modes of thought are legitimate and necessary, but for this very reason, neither can be absorbed in the other. There must therefore be both. Calculating thought, which is concerned with makeability, and reflective thought, which is concerned with meaning. And one cannot deny that the Freiburg philosopher has a good deal of justification for expressing the fear that in an age in which calculating thought is celebrating the most amazing triumphs man has ever seen, humanity is nevertheless threatened, perhaps more than ever, by thoughtlessness, by the flight from thought, by a lack of meaning. So that's what I wanted to say. Dewey's system, I think the ultimate problem with it is that if you're only obsessed with this calculating thought, with this making thought, with this what Joseph Pieper would call ratio, then you lose the capacity to receive the meaning of your life, which is ultimately what education should be about, right? Like you were talking about, being led out of yourself to receive from above the meaning upon which you can stand. And
and I think it's ultimately where, maybe to be a little bit overly general and critics of our contemporary education, is we're not immersed in the logos anymore.
Yeah.
We're moving away from that. And that's kind of one of my basic points, having already read some of this stuff by Ratzinger in the past. There's a separation of action and being.
Yes.
Of identity and mission.
Yes.
Of being and doing.
Right.
With the emphasis on doing
Right.
and the lack of emphasis on being.
Yeah.
And so we can't find what meaning is. In fact, we're just becoming instruments of our own ego. And our will and intellect continues extending to the extent that we can create by force this thing we call reality into our own meaning.
Yeah, and it's why as products of the public school system, it's so difficult for us to conceive of like success. At least this has been the case in my life. Like, it's been like an intellectual and spiritual conversion for me, like a transformation that's required death to self and repentance for me to stop viewing success in these merely like productive terms, right? Like, God doesn't care about your like economic productivity. He doesn't care, like he does. I mean, but that's not primary. What's primary is you like contemplating the reality of God and growing into deeper union with him.
Our Blessed Mother, man.
Yes. That's
my soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord.
Yeah.
She didn't have a lot.
Right.
They traveled. They were not welcomed as refugees.
Yeah.
With God incarnate in her womb.
Mm-hmm.
And she still was receptive to that grace. She was receptive to the Holy Spirit, to receiving what truth was. Truth itself, himself,
yes,
in her.
God has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. But the lowly can only be lifted up because they receive from above what is given to them, what raises them up into perfection. They don't make it for themselves.
Jesus Christ did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at. Rather, he emptied himself in love for us.
And insofar as Dewey's recommendations are reasonable, like his pedagogy, right? Like some of his methods for teaching, like some of them might be actually helpful in the classroom to get students to be more engaged. Kind of like, I know like the Montessori school method definitely wants kids to be engaged and like drivers of the process to a certain extent. But our doing, our activity can only flourish and have any ultimate meaning or purpose if it is grounded in our more fundamental receptivity, which is why a student who is being led in the classroom and who is being given the chance to actually drive the educational process first needs to receive from the teacher. Like that dynamic has to be there, that condescending of the teacher, condescending in a good way, like moving down to lift the student up. Like that has to be there if the student is going to be able to flourish, even if you do want them to be actively engaged.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought in Ratzinger. He's a freaking, I read that so long ago and it's still equally as good.
Well, it's just crazy because like we're reading about John Dewey and I was like, I think Ratzinger said something about this, which is like, you could say that about anybody you're reading.
That's true. Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for bearing with me through that. There was a lot, but
I think it was good. And I think our listeners are going to benefit from it. You let us know what you thought about that and us reading from books in general. I think it's a good idea. I think it's specifically pertinent, connected to the fact that we're talking about philosophy in this episode. Ratzinger himself being an outstanding philosopher and theologian, and a lot of ways kind of summarizing what we've been trying to say.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of John Dewey, friends. So we've kind of, just to summarize what we've been talking about here, we began by pointing to kind of John Dewey's life, pragmatism, that philosophy, his philosophy of education, as it were, what the purpose of the school that helps embody his theory of education serves, how and what the school serves. And then we talked about kind of try to give a counter proposal through the Catholic vision of what that is, relying heavily on Ratzinger and Joseph Pieper and the likes. So we're in good company. Thank you for listening, guys.
That was a good episode.
If you are this far in, you're probably willing to rate our episode or like or share. And we would like for you to take a few moments to do that because it's very, very helpful to our project. And
yeah, please do.
It makes us very rich, and we're still aspiring to get Teslas, which we haven't yet, but in due season we will.
Also, I know that most of our listeners do not watch our podcast on YouTube, but if you do listen to us and you like our stuff, it'd be super helpful if you actually just like went to our YouTube page and subscribed, or like some of our videos and stuff, because that would be, I know it's a podcast, so most people aren't watching it.
Yeah, I don't blame
them. YouTube actually is, we're hoping to build our YouTube page, and it's slowly growing. And if you did that, that'd be super helpful for us. So that'd be great.
Yeah. There's John Dewey. There's Deacon Joseph, the new Deacon Joseph. Deacon Max here. Guys, thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast. We hope this brought you closer to our logos, to the logos, Jesus Christ. And as always, God bless.